Hi, I'm Dale Popovich, and I'm here to do a demonstration for you using three colors. I've used these before. I always try to have my students, whether in a workshop or in one of my classes, to keep your palette simple. Um, I'm painting in the feeling of Anders Zorn, uh, who was a Swedish painter, and he did some beautiful paintings with limited palette. They assume that his palette consisted of yellow ochre, cadmium red medium, and ivory black, and white. He was mostly an oil painter, but some believe he occasionally would use vermilion or viridian or cerulean blue. You can institute different colors within a palette many times, especially a limited palette. Um, but you try to keep things simple. Um, you want to try to encourage discipline on yourself. And in doing so, limiting your palette allows you to understand color mixing better in relationships. So by paring down the tools at hand, you can focus on the essentials of the principles of painting, the value, the shape, and the design. And we all know that value does all the work and color always gets all the glory. Um, but he once, Sargent once remarked about there's only one point in placing a brushstroke, and if it's correct in color, shape, value, and direction, then you're correct. Um, but the irony of a limited palette lies in its actual freedom. If you have too many palettes or too many colors on your palette, you will get more of a confused look many times. Um, so you're compelled to explore the nuances of mixing those particular colors that is limited and observe the subtle variations in nature. With just three or four colors, a surprising range of hues can emerge on your palette right in front of you. So you want to try to keep it simple. And the irony of a limited palette lies in the freedom. By restricting pigments, one explores the nuances of mixing and observes the nature's subtle variations. With just three or four colors, a range of hues emerge, providing complexity comes from the artist's skill, not the number of pigments. So keep that in mind. This is what I always employ on my uh, students in workshops or in my class that I teach uh, in Zoom class at the Palette and Chisel or through the Palette and Chisel. I'm going to show you here first before I get started. This is one painting, and I'm using the same three colors without all three paintings. They are done with ultramarine blue, sap green, and burnt sienna. Okay. This was a stormy day on the shores of Lake Superior in the Upper Peninsula. And this one here next to it is done with the same three colors, and this was an old farmhouse not far from where we live in the north woods of Wisconsin. And it was predominantly green. The house was green, the lawn was green, the forest was green. So everything took on something green. And what I wanted to do was transform it into a little bit warmer scene than what was being proposed in front of me. So I used more warm colors on the house to create a stronger relationship and a focal point. And I warmed up the ground quite a bit. I did push the background back with different values of green, blue, green. I put in some reds in back in here and some yellow greens. But I wasn't using yellow. It appears that I was, but the burnt sienna has a lot of yellow in it. So we're going to get started here, but these are the two paintings I've already done. I'm going to do a third, and it's going to be much warmer than what I had done previously here. So we are going to get started here, and we're using the same three colors. I'm using Core watercolor pigment, and I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and sap green. uh, just to give you the idea. And it's all on how you cross mix the colors. You can lean this way, that way, or the other way. But remember, you're trying to get the values correct. The values will do everything for you, where if you're going to put a lot of color on a poor valued painting, it's not going to help. So this is the photograph that I'm using. If we can see this, try to get it out of the light. It's a fall scene uh, down in northwest Indiana, and it's the Kankakee River. And it was flowing very slowly that day. There was no movement. We've had very little rain at that time, taken a few years back. And we want to get started. Now, what do I want to employ here is that the block-in method is always the same, basically, 9 times out of 10. Sometimes I'll do something a little bit different, but it's always large to small areas. You don't want to block in little areas and then build up from there. Big areas to smaller areas. You want to work from background to foreground, and you keep that process repeated until the background is set. So you're not painting around everything. And you're painting your values from light to dark, which is reverse of what oil painters do because of the way we use the pigment. Our white that we're using, in actuality, is the paper with the light coming through the pigment and bouncing back up. And the amount of water that you're using will allow it to be lighter or darker. And then finally, you're working your colors more intense to grade down colors as you move through it. You really can't get your colors more intense than you can at the very beginning of the painting, with the exception of putting the same color on the same color. It will be more intense. So when you're working large to small, that means you're working your brushes from large to small brushes. I do use a toothbrush here for texture, for lifting color and adding color. So here we go. We're going to get started here. And I'm going to start by taking the burnt sienna, like so, a lot of it. And I'm going to wet the paper just a little bit with my spray bottle, just a tiny bit. And I'm going to take a little bit of the ultramarine blue, and this will help gray it down. Now, burnt sienna is a grayed down red-orange virtually, and I use burnt sienna quite a bit because it does help gray things down. So I'm going to start off over here, and I'm working fairly loose, and I'm taking a little bit more pure burnt sienna here. You can see how red-orange it looks. And I'm going to take a little bit of green here, and I'm going to add that down towards the bottom here. But you try to get as much variety as you can in the painting. And again, don't be tied to your photograph. You're painting a painting. You're not painting a copy of the photograph. So be a little bit more exploratory and having fun with it. So I'm adding other colors in here while it is still wet. And one of the things about watercolor is that I cannot teach you is the water pigment ratio. But I'm adding a little bit more green down here at the bottom to get some of that green grass in. I don't want to have one color sticking out. I want a dominant color theme, basically. And then I'm going to go into the background here, which I really should have done to begin with, but I wanted to control this part over here a little bit more. And I'm trying to keep my edges as soft as possible for as long as possible. And this is the whole point of painting with watercolor. You can always get things sharper later on, but you don't want to paint with sharp edges at the beginning. And I'm going to go to my bigger brush here. That's a little bit bigger than my Chinese brush that I have. And I am going to take the burnt sienna with just a little bit of water, and I'm going to start by adding it right down here. Now, I have a spot in between here that I'm going to allow to meld together here a little bit more. And I'm painting the water reflection straight down. And I'm going to start adding a little bit of ultramarine blue to this. And I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue, like so. And I'm going to add that real dark up on the shoreline here. And I'm going to allow it to meld with the reflection that is just down below it. And in this particular case, I want to get rid of all the white of the paper here. I'll go back and make things a little bit different later. I want to add a little bit more blue in here to get it darker, and then we're going to leave it dry. Now, at this point, I'm going to take the toothbrush and I'm going to add water to this. And I want it to run a little bit. So I'm going to tip the board up just a slight bit. Just take the toothbrush like so, just so it runs downhill a little bit. I'm going to go back and grab my Chinese brush here and add in, while it's still wet. If you go back in too late, you'll end up with blooms. And we're going to add texture to this later. But what I want to do right now is I want to take a natural sponge and I want to lift a little bit right here in this area right here, just to give the illusion of what's up above it, like so. And I can always go darker. It's a little bit more difficult to go lighter. Now, all these little white spots will disappear as I move through the painting. I'm going to get rid of some of these right away. But the background is darker, it's grayer, it's cooler, so it will recede. And detail is unimportant at this particular point. So we're going to take a moment and we're going to stop and let this dry. And while it's drying, the best thing to do is to sit on your hands and watch it dry. Have a cup of coffee, whatever the case may be. Okay, we're back and we're ready to start again. And again, I'm going to go back to the background. I'm going to concentrate first on this area and then come across and then come down. So it's always background to foreground. Now, in the background, we have subdued colors, grayed down colors. So there is a green tinge back there with the brown. You can kind of sneak up on it if you want. So I'm mixing all three colors, different variation. I'm trying to get the idea of subtle texture back there, but not too much, because a good background always stays back, of course. And I'm going to start here at the bottom. And I'm going to add a little bit more blue to that, kind of a grayed down green. I'm going to add a little bit more green to it. So I'm always a great proponent of every 3, 5, 6 brush strokes of changing your temperature, your color, your intensity, trying to get enough variance of what you want to happen in the background, um, or anywhere else. But I'm trying to limit uh, the amount of brush strokes with the same color. So I'm taking a little bit of green in the burnt sienna here at this point, and I'll show you what I do with it. I'm not trying to cover everything I previously put down, but the fact that it helps create a little bit of depth. So I'm dry brushing, and usually when I'm dry brushing, I will take the pigment and I'll tap the brush off a little bit to get rid of some of the moisture. And I'm going to take a little bit of blue here, and I'm going to institute a few darker darks at the bottom where the river meets the water. And I'm just trying to give it a little bit of variance back here. Now I'm going to take a little bit of the burnt sienna, mix it in with the green up here, and I'm going to give this a little bit more color up here where at the top it's receiving a little bit more light. And I'm going to add a little bit of green as we go into the woods here, where it starts appearing a little bit more. Everything's in shadow back there, so when you have things in shadow, you want to try to keep them kind of grayed down. And we have a little bit of an angle on the river here. So I'm taking a little bit of straight blue, like so. And I'm going to soften that just a little bit. At this point, I'm going to take the toothbrush and I'm going to add color. And why I do it with the toothbrush is that I'm adding color without touching the board. So I'm adding a little bit of green back here, and I'm going to take a little bit of burnt sienna. And while it's still wet, straight burnt sienna, while it's still wet, it will kind of mingle with the other colors that are still wet. So timing is a lot to do with the watercolor painting. When to put things down. And I'm trying to get a little bit of that variance of the frilliness of the leaves up against there, up against the light. And I've got enough color back there. I'm going to be very careful not adding too much, but I do want to add a little bit of the ultramarine blue in here to punctuate that going around the bend here. And as I do that, I'm going to take my smaller brush and I'm going to manipulate that just a little bit. And I'm going to kind of drag it into this area here. Now, there's a number of things you can do with a watercolor. Don't be afraid to experiment. Not everything always works out, but that's part of the painting process. If you're always frightened to make a mistake, you'll make a mistake, trust me. And I'm adding just little brush strokes at this point, kind of intermingle with what's already there. But never be afraid to make mistakes. You will make mistakes. The idea is to not repeat them as often as you think you might make them. But I'm going to take this and I'm going to paint down at this point. And I'm going to use my other larger brush here. And I'm going to take the burnt sienna mixed up with a little bit of the ultramarine blue. And it's amazing what these three colors can do. And I'm going to paint this directly straight down. And I'm going to take the ultramarine blue and I'm going to mix this in. While it's still wet, it will bleed in together and it will combine its colors a little bit nicer. Now, as it comes out into the light a little bit more, I'm going to intensify this just a little bit more, like so, and just allowing it to fall. All these other little shapes in here are insignificant at this time. So don't try to overpaint it or play with the detail. Detail is always last. I'm going to take the toothbrush and I'm going to add a little bit of pigment in there. And then I'm going to go very, very lightly into this area here so that this area will show up. And I can always lighten it a little bit as we move through it, but I'm coming over to this area here that I want fairly dark, punctuated a little bit more. And the thing about painting anything, there's adjustments you have to make. Adjustments on the values, adjustments on color, intensity. You don't always want to follow that photograph because it can get you in trouble. Now, along the edge here, I'm going to take a little bit of the ultramarine blue and some of the green mixed in with the burnt sienna. Tap it off on the paper towel, and I'm going to create that bottom ridge or opening where the water hits the land. Like so. I want to get a little bit of green in the reflection here. And then what I'll do is that it kind of softens itself, add a little bit of water to it. Now you can always go darker, but it's harder to go lighter and make it look good. So be very careful. Take your timing of the watercolor very seriously. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to take the burnt sienna, very light with a little bit of green in it, a little bit more green. And I'm going to tap the brush off and I'm going to very carefully dry brush this in. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to kind of sock it in a little bit more here with some very intense color with a little bit of green. And I'm going to put this in here like so. This is going to be darker back here. And I'm being now very conscious of this ridge in here where the grass meets the woods. And I'm going to take a little bit of ultramarine blue mixed in with there. And I'm going to kind of dry brush that in to where the bottom of the woods is receiving a little bit less light where it kind of goes in, where sunlight is a little bit harder to get to. I'm going to paint a little bit in here to give this a little bit change there. I'm also going to take the toothbrush once again, and I'm going to add water right in here in this middle area here. And I want to drag some of the green down in there a little bit more, like so. And then I'm going to take the burnt sienna in a very, very light form here, lots of water. Trying to get the pigment water ratio is always a little bit difficult, but I'm adding this in as a texture. It's a matter of practicing Practice on scrap paper. It always helped me when I was a student. Now we're getting a basic imprint of a stronger imprint of the photograph as a painting here. And while it's still wet, I'm going to pull out a few little lights here and there with the brush that I feel are important at this particular juncture. And there's always something more you can do, but before you do it, decide whether it's needed or not. I'm always a great proponent of watching the paint dry. And I'm adding a few more values in here because I'm pushing and pulling the value because of the colors I'm using. And I'm going to try to cover up those little white spots that are showing. I don't want those showing up like that. This is a great exercise to learn how to cross-mix color and see what you can do with it. What you come up with, something a little bit more exciting than trying to use too many colors. Right now, I'm just in the part of manipulating and pulling out some of the lights that I feel are important. And I'm doing it very, very slowly so that I don't overwork it, especially at an early stage. In the photograph, it has sky up here. I ignored that. Don't really need it. And I'm pulling out some, what I feel is important lights to the painting, because this is going to be my focal point area. And you don't always need a focal point area, although it always makes a stronger composition, stronger painting. But you can have points of interest in your painting to lead the eye, but you don't always have to have them. And I'm going along softening a few of the edges and so forth. I might even go in and use a little bit of gouache, white paint, for emphasis on some of the lights that I want to retain. But I'm going to leave that up to the very end of the painting. And I'll explain different ways you can use white. I'm pulling that log in there right now. And I'm going to take a little bit of the green here, straight green, and I'm going to kind of embellish this just a little bit more. And whatever I do up here, I got to do a little bit down here to balance it off, show if it's up here. It's also going to be in the reflection. And we're going to take a little break here, and we're going to leave this dry. But for three colors, it's a red-orange, which is the burnt sienna, the ultramarine blue, which is a dark blue, and then green. I have no yellow, but I'm making this appear almost as a yellow at this point in relationship with everything else. So let's take a little break here, and we're going to leave this dry. Okay, we're back. I've left it dry. And one of the things about it drying is you want to feel it with the back of your hand because the palm has oil on it. And we want to leave it go bone dry before you start back in, because you can make some mistakes that you really don't want to have happen. And again, as you noticed, I haven't put any tree trunks in. I'm still dealing with larger masses and secondary masses, trying to get things put together a little bit more before I start in on any type of detail. The detail, again, as I'm always telling people, it's really unimportant at this point. I do want to manipulate a few of the lights that are in here by lifting. So I'm taking my 1-inch brush here first, and I can manipulate a few things up in here that I want to pull out. So what I do is I dampen the brush or rinse it off actually, and then squeeze all the water out. And I can get my lights fairly light with this by repeating the same type of movement back and forth. But we want to get this a little bit lighter in certain areas. In darker areas, it will show up a little bit better. But you can lift a dark more easily than you can lift a light. So you have to be kind of suggestive in a light area. It's not going to come out exactly what you feel it might or what you want. I am looking at some areas down in here where I want a little bit more light coming out. And whatever I do up here, I want to do in the water just to show the reflection a little bit nicer. And the tree trunks I haven't put in yet. That's part of what I call the detail. You've noticed I've cleaned my mixing area off for the simple fact that your color will start to get muddy. Some people say, well, how do I remix that color? You don't want it exact anyways. And with more remixing of color, you will get used to mixing new colors up and making it more accurate. But I am lifting up certain areas that I feel are important to the painting. Not all, but just the few that I feel are needed. And I can lift up areas and add color within those light areas also. So I'm being selective at this point. I don't want to overthink it, but I am manipulating a few of these small areas. I'm not going to make this sharp up here because it doesn't need to be. I just sort of let it drift off. It's this area here that becomes important. Now, at this point, I am going to take my toothbrush just with water on it, and I want to create a little bit more texture in here, a little bit more variance. So I'm going to take the toothbrush and I'm going to spritz just water on here. It'll show up great in the dark area. Leave it there just for a few seconds, and I press and pull up. Need a little bit more. This can be done repeatedly. And this will help create a texture that you can follow. It's coming up a little bit, but not a whole lot. I like this area in the painting to be a little bit darker because our eyes are attracted to lighter areas and contrast of value first. So this is going to remain dark over here. I'm going to do a little bit back in here. It will show up a little bit easier back here. As you can see, it's starting to show up here. Gives it a little bit more subtlety of form and value change. Not too much, but just enough. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to take my smallest brush here, and I'm going to work on this area up in here first. And I'm going to take the burnt sienna, and I'm going to take the ultramarine blue, but predominantly burnt sienna. If you can't see the color because it's so dark, take a little bit more water. You'll be able to see it in a lighter form. So I'm taking this right here. And I think I'm going to add just a touch of green to it. And I'm going to tap the brush off, and on its side, I'm going to begin adding that texture that I was looking for. And I'm being very careful not to do it equally. I'm being very careful not to repeat the same pattern. So I'm kind of jumping around, working a little bit more randomly. And I'm going to add a little bit more green to it. As we move up and out, I'm going to add a touch more water to it. And since we're working with just three colors, long as those three colors are holding together, we should be doing fine. Use a little bit more water in some areas. I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'll always bounce back and forth, but I want to add a little bit more darkness to the opening down here. I don't want to cover too much of it. I'm being very careful at this point. And I'm going to take a little bit less dark, and I'm going to add it in down here. And I'm going to dry brush this up in here. I'm going to take a little bit of that dark and maneuver it up in here, but you can see it's all disconnected. It's not a line of connection. The eye will automatically connect it anyways. Now I'm going to take some of the burnt sienna, in this case, as I'm moving out into the lighter area. This is where the yellow leaves are at, but we're not using yellow. We'll make it appear to be visually correct value-wise first, and then not worry about the color. You could be off on the color, but you have to have the value, the temperature, and the intensities correct to make it work. You've seen that many times in movie posters. Colors are not right. They're all different colors, the different reality colors, but they are correct within its own frame of reference. And I'm going to smooth this out a little bit more because you're not going to see a bunch of darks out there. And then I'm going to take the toothbrush with a little bit of burnt sienna on it and a fair amount of water. And I'm going to spritz this onto here to give it a little bit of texture. Again, we have not even got into the tree branches yet and the trunks. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this darker pigment here with a little bit of green in it, add a little bit more burnt sienna to it. Our darks get a little bit lighter as they move away from us. It's not going to be as dark as this. But I am adding a few of these lighter darks, or mid-tones, as we want to call them, in here. I'm going to add a little bit of green on this down here. So we have a transition that looks more realistic. And that's what we're looking for, is a realistic look without worrying about the color. And I'm just sort of laying the brush on the paper here just a little bit. Now, I'm going to go in and I'm going to start putting in some darker dark, some more definition. I'm going to take this green paint here, mixed in with a little bit of the light burnt sienna, and I'm going to start modeling down here, up into the shadow area here, where it kind of creeps up into the woods. It's going to be a little bit darker. I can add a little bit of texture in here, like so. Because after this, we're going to be putting tree trunks in, strengthen and reflection, and then I'll show you how to go into the use of opaque watercolor and translucent watercolor. Working with gouache with watercolor is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, if you're working large pieces, you may not want to use the gouache that's a watercolor base, but you may want to use white gesso, which will expand and contract on larger pieces where you're using it a little bit thicker. It won't crack and fall off over time. Now, I'm going to go in and I'm going to put in some of these dark areas that are kind of in shadow where the water comes up and meets the bank. This gives it a little bit more definition. And I'm doing it as a broken line. Sometimes you'll see it all the way along the shore. Don't do that. You don't need to show all those things. I'm going to add some darker darks in here. And I'm going to add a few darks down at the end with a little bit of the green and the blue. And I'm going to define this as some negative painting down here, just to go in into the woods here a little bit more and show the bank of the river going around the turn, like so. And I want to get that a little bit darker back in here. Not too dark, but a little bit darker. So that this, I'm going to pull out that log later on. I want to show a little bit of that dark reflecting into the water back here. There we go. And then I'll hit it with just a brush with some water in it, like so. And we're starting to turn around the bank there. Now, I want to get a little bit more variance in on the reflection into the water back here, starting with the background. So I'm taking a little bit of blue, the ultramarine blue that I'm using, and a little bit of the green, a little bit more blue, and some of the burnt sienna I have right there. And this will give me the, I'm going to dry the brush off a little bit so I don't have too much pigment on here. And I'm bringing some of that darkness down into the water. Going to add a little bit more. And then I'm going to add a little bit more burnt sienna right in here. And over here. And then just sort of feather it out. And I'm doing it very quickly, not worried about the water going back and forth at this point. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Just so we're getting a feeling of what's going on. Okay, now we're going to go and put the trees in. And I'm going to use the 1-inch flat brush here, and I'm going to pull out the birch trees that are on the shoreline. And you can start at the bottom of the top. I do it both ways, but I'm going to start right here. And once you start putting the trees in, it's going to take on a little bit different look. And you can repeat this until you get to your desired lightness that you want. I'm going to be very careful not to get too light because you're trapping a light between all these darks, which you don't want to do. And I'm going to try to do them at different intervals, different thicknesses. I don't want it looking like they were planted evenly apart. So I'm going to be very conscious of that. And I'm just placing them at this point. I'm not trying to do a finished look to them just yet. Give a little bit of that reflection down here. A little bit later up towards the top near the reflection, and just sort of let it go off. This one here will be starting right about here, and that will go down like that. I'm not trying to make them even necessarily, but I do want to get some of these other trees in up here. And we can make them lighter. How you do it is up to you. But I'm going to tell you that when you're doing this, you want to try to show enough variety. Weave them in and out of the leaves a little bit if necessary. And I'm going to pull out a little bit over here. I do have a habit of jumping around the painting for the simple fact that I'm leaving some areas dry over here, so I'm adding some things over here. There, that breaks that up a little bit. I don't work in one area too long. So when you're putting it in the trees, try to give variety, not only in size and shape, but the separation of the trees. And try to make them look like they have different thicknesses. And I'm going to bring out a tree down here at the bottom. And what you're going to see in the next few steps is the painting coming a little bit more to life. And I'm going to go along and soften a few things here and there. It's going to be a little bit more subdued than what the photograph is, but that's okay. I want to bring a little bit more light in on this tree. So I am lifting and repeating that lifting. Sometimes I have a 1-inch ox hair that I'm using. If you have a synthetic brush, 1-inch flat, that works just as well. But I'm usually a great proponent of real hair brushes. They load a little bit nicer. They hold more water, more pigment. And they just handle nicer. That's just a personal thing with me. But you got to have good paints, good paper. As I said before, I'm working with indigo paints, and I'm working with, or not indigo paints, but core paint. And I'm working with indigo watercolor paper, 300 pound. And I'm lifting a little bit more vigorously. This paper I have to be very careful with for the fact that it has a certain softness to it. And it kind of lends itself more towards the type of work I do, the landscapes and so forth. I'm going to put a fallen log right here. But this does have a totally different look than the actual photograph. But my intention is not to have the same look as the photograph. I always try to be a little bit more creative with it. I'm adjusting some of the values at this point by lifting a little bit. And some finishing touches with the transparent watercolor now. I'm going to take a little bit of the sap green and I'm going to put it in on the bank right up in here where it's receiving a little bit less light, because the more light you have that hits your subject matter, it's going to be washed out in color a little bit. And in shadow, you lose the color. So I'm giving it a little bit more variance there. I will give a little bit more green up in the trees here, just a slight bit more to pull that color up. It's going to be more subdued than some of the other colors, but that's fine. But anything you do, don't drip on your own watercolor, by the way. Anything that you do is an experiment to a certain degree. And I don't like to get comfortable using the same colors or using them in different ways. I like to get a little bit more variety in what I do. And I'm going to bring a little bit more red-orange from up here down to here. So I'm using the burnt sienna again, and I'm going to be a little bit more lighter with it. Gives the water a little bit more form. And all I'm doing is I'm dry brushing it on to the paper at this point, adding a few accents of color here and there. And at this point, I need to suggest something way in the background. So I'm going to suggest a couple of trees back in here, like so. And very light, just very subtle. You can't be bold in the background. Put a couple logs coming down on the shoreline here. Again, very subtle. Because if you make it stick out too much, it's going to be a little bit strong. It's going to detract from what your intention is. I'm going to take a little bit of the ultramarine blue. These are all little accents of color at this point at the very end. I'm going to add some blue in here. And I want to get this a little bit darker here as you're seeing maybe through the peninsula there or the turn in the river. And you're seeing some of those darks back there pop through. I've done this painting once before in a totally different palette. Had a lot of fun doing it. This is the first time I've done it in a limited palette. But like I said, it's something that try some things that are a little bit different. I'm adding little accents of darks here down towards the river. I want to add a few little darks up in here. And when I'm doing this, I'm always squinting down occasionally to see the value relationship. Is the value right? Like so. All right. A couple more things, and we're going to show you how to use opaque watercolor. I think I said that a couple steps back, but I'm going to come in here and pull up a few little lights out here. Not too much. All right. Now I'm going to take my smaller brush, clean my palette again. And when you're using white paint, um, you want to take note that white changes the value, it lightens it. It changes its intensity, it de-intensifies it because you're getting lighter, because the most intense form of a color is coming out of the tube. And it also cools the color. So if you add white to, let's say, red, red will become a little bit cooler. If you add white to blue, it's going to become a little bit cooler. So what I'm doing in this essence is I'm playing with the temperature and the value and the intensity of the color to a great extent. The hue itself is going to be basically the same. So when you're wanting to add white to a color, start off by mixing the color first. And I'm going to take a little bit of the green here. So take the color, mix the color you want, and then what you want to do is take a little bit of white. So I have the white gouache here by Winsor Newton White Designer Gouache. I'm going to put it a little bit here, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it over here, like so. And I'm going to add in some lighter value colors here and there. I think if I take the burnt sienna just with the white, I think I'll be fine. And I'm adding just a little bit of white to this. Going to take a little bit more white here. And I'm adding just a little bit of detail on this, not too much up above. But you want to go slow with this too. Kind of tease it in a little bit. See what it looks like. There's two ways to use the gouache too. One is opaque as I'm using it now, and the other is using it translucently. So I have a little bit more pigment in this time. There was too much white in it before. If you use too much white, it's going to get chalky. So you want to kind of tease it in a little bit. And being opaque means you can't see through it. Now, if you add more water to it, to where you can see through it, it becomes translucent, almost like stained glass window or milk glass. So I'm adding a little bit of different variances of the gouache here. You can see it a little bit better back in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a lot of white to this. And I'm going to pull out some of these birches here, just a little bit here. I'm not going to pull them out to where they're really light because they'll be too light against the background. So I'm kind of sneaking up on it. Now, with a lot of water in this, I should be able to see through to the other pigment, which I am now. I'm going to add a little bit of green to that. And then add a little bit of white and a lot of water. So it becomes translucent. Think of stained glass window or a milky consistency. And you can get all sorts of different variances this way. And I'm going to add a little bit of white this down here, like so. And I'm going to add a little bit more white to that green, like this. And I'm going to add that down in here. This will give a little bit different variance to things. And I want to put a little bit of that green down below in the water, just to give it a little bit of a reflection. I'm going to take a lot of that white paint, I'm going to add it to the green, and I'm going to add it in down here. And I'm doing very sparingly. I don't want to go in and use a lot of this. It's not used for correcting mistakes, as I've caught some of my studio students doing that back in Indiana when we lived there. And I'm going to add a little bit more green to this. This is giving it a whole different look to it at this point, with the green against the warm. There's not a lot of blue showing, if you've noticed. And I'm going to give a little bit of green back in here. And if you've added too much, take a damp brush and maneuver it a little bit, and you can soften things out. I'm going to take a little bit more white in this case, and I'm going to add some of the later green leaves out towards the end of the tree. Add a little bit down here. So you can get all sorts of variations. The best thing to do with this sometimes is to simply play with it, see what happens. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. There's so many mistakes you can make. The more you make, the better off you are, because you won't make them later on. And I made a lot of them as a student. I have a whole landfill in my name someplace. I'm going to give this a little bit more of a greener tinge up in here. Take out a little bit. So I'm toning it down just a slight bit. I'm going to bring some of the green into the woods. And add it to the birch trees. They don't have to be a light. Actually, birch trees are not white. They are variance colors that are reflecting onto it from around the area. But this is kind of fun to work the watercolor in such a manner. Think of it as an adventure. I'm going to add a little bit of color back in here with this. And I'm going to take a lot of white, add it to the green with a little bit of that burnt sienna. And I'm going to pull this log out a little bit here, like so. And I have another log here that's going to be a little bit bigger. Just sort of rough it off into the grass. But these I find to be relaxing when I'm painting, because I'm thinking of it as a journey, not something that has to be perfect. I think the most frightening part of a painting is the white of the paper staring back at you. And all I'm doing is I'm adding little nuances here and there. And I'm going to take the sap green and a little bit of the burnt sienna here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have just a few. I think I'm going to use a smaller brush because I just want a little bit of a reflected color coming up through the water here. Little things floating in the water that are catching the light. Many times people will tell you don't touch the paper with your fingers. Well, I do. And what I'll do is I'll dry off this brush here and I will manipulate it a little bit, soften it. I don't want it that quite that bright, just enough to make it sing a different color. Like so. Nothing fancy. This is an experimentation in color. Use it as an experiment. Don't be frightened of making mistakes. And I think the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a few darker trees with the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. And I'll take the tape off and see what it looks like. Take my paper towel, dry this off just a little bit. And I'm going to weave in some of the branches from darker trees coming through here, just so we have an idea of something holding up this mass. Your little accents down in here. And it has a totally different look than the photograph, which I expected. Don't expect it to look like the photograph. Don't try to make it look like the photograph, because you're just going to disappoint yourself. Play with the color, experiment with the color, try to see what the color variances you can mix up. And I add just a few more things here and there, maybe a couple dark logs coming down. And I'm going to take a little bit of this light grayed down burnt sienna, add just a little bit of white to it. And I'm going to hit it here and there in the water, just to give it a little bit of sparkle. Or perhaps leaves floating in and around here. So this is where we're going to stop, and I'll take the tape off. And by the way, there's always something more you can do with it, but take a look at it, stare at it for a while. Look at it for a day. Have a cup of tea, cup of coffee, glass of wine. Put it at a 5 to 6 foot distance from you when it's about this size. This is not that big, but I do want to show you the difference between the other two and this one to show what 3 colors can do in 3 different ways, which I feel is important. So we have something that is done today that is a prominently warmer, something that was cooler. This is kind of fun. It's got quite a bit different look to it, and something that was quite cool from the beginning. I gotta move things around here to make everything fit. So same three colors on all three of them, but take a look at how you can cross mix color and make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more fun, and also a huge learning experience. So I want to thank you for watching, and tune in next time.